Welcome to the first in our fall 2021 book talks. Miriam Hirsch is an associate professor of education and chair of the educator preparation program at Stern College for Women at YU, where she teaches courses in the arts and education, classroom management, teaching social studies, and the literature of pedagogy. She holds a PhD in educational administration, leadership, and technology from New York University, an MA in curriculum and teaching, and an MA in arts education from Teachers College. A licensed K-6 elementary school teacher, Dr. Hirsch taught in the classroom for many years and worked as an assistant principal of a girls' elementary school before moving to higher education. Her research examines the influence of school stories and narrative inquiry in education. She has published work in journals such as Teaching Education, Educational Leadership, The Teacher Educator, The Educational Forum, it's like it goes on and on, Schools, Studies in Education, the Arts and Humanities in Higher Education, the Journal of Jewish Education, and Jewish Educational Leadership. I think you've written quite a bit, Dr. Hirsch. Teach Like a Human, Essays for Parents and Teachers is her first book. Miriam is the proud mom of 5 daughters and lives with her family in Passaic, New Jersey. We are fortunate to have Dr. Deena Rabinovich discuss the book with Dr. Hirsch. Dr. Rabinovich is chair, Rebecca Ivory Jewish Studies Department, and director, Legacy Heritage Fund, Jewish Educators Project. Now, after the Q&A, after we have the discussion, we're going to have a Q&A time, and then we're going to hold a virtual raffle to win a free copy of the book. So there'll be 2 books that will be 2 chances to win a free book. So you better stay till the end. I'm sure you want to stay to the end anyway, but that's an incentive. And may you be the lucky winner.
Hey, so thank you so much, Shalamis, for the introduction. Thank you to everybody for coming and joining us tonight. And for listening to Dr. Hirsch talk about her book. When I was reading it, it felt like I was in her seminar. I've never had the privilege of being there, but since we've taught so many of the same students over the years, I've certainly culled a lot of wonderful information by the same students, and it's a pleasure to talk this evening about your book. So Dr. Hirsch, welcome. I don't know if you want to say any words of welcome before I officially begin to ask you questions.
So I just want to begin by thanking Shalamis and everybody in the library, thanking Deena, who is one of the busiest people I know, for helping put this together. I'm grateful to both of you. I also have tremendous Hakaras Tov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the ability to put down on paper and secure some ideas that I've been working with for a long time, as well as the opportunity to dialogue with you tonight and talk about things that matter a great deal to both of us.
Okay, thank you. So the first question I have, you mentioned when you were telling me about this book that these were a series of essays that have been sort of percolating in your mind for quite some time that you wanted to publish and bring out to bring out to the masses before you got to another book. So I'll ask you about that later, but for right now, what was so compelling? There's a variety of different topics that are covered in this book. What was your main goal in writing this?
Sure. So I'm going to do the short answer and then I'll do the long answer. The short answer is that I had a bunch of unpublished essays and things that I had written. The last essay actually was published in a journal, and talks that I'd given. And I had a bunch of pieces, and it took me a very long time to figure out how to frame them. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I work inductively, meaning that I work from the ground up, and I had a bunch of these pieces and I couldn't figure out a pattern or relationship between them. And ultimately it came to me that it was the intersection between the dominant roles in my life of being a teacher and a parent and a teacher. So that's kind of the short answer. The longer answer is that there were 2 research studies that really influenced my thinking, as well as my own set of lived experiences. And the first research experience was in 2015, we had 2 graduates from our program join Teach for America, and get jobs in a charter school in the South Bronx. It was a charter school organization. We'd never had anybody come from our program and go into Teach for America and go into charter schools. And so it was a compelling question for me, how are they going to do from our program, which is such a constructivist program, into a charter school organization? And at that time, I didn't know so much about charter school organizations. So I followed them for 2 years. I did qualitative interview and observations of them. And I looked at some data that they shared with me. And it was an incredibly unique environment. I was wowed at the beginning. Students in the classroom would sit in a scholar position like this with their hands steepled and their legs together. They choreography from place to place where they stood up, pushed in their chair, and marched to a line was amazing. And I was talking about it at home with my family, and one of my kids said to me, well, do the students ever ask questions? And I said, come to think of it, actually, no, I've never seen a student raise their hand and say, I don't understand. Like that didn't happen because there was a management system with a stoplight and nobody called out and nobody interrupted the teacher. So that was the first research study that really got into my head about what are we doing in education, because we want a sense of tight procedures in a classroom, but what is the cost of over tight procedures? And then the second research study that I did, anybody that was in my literature of pedagogy class historically from years ago knows that at the end of the semester, after reading firsthand memoirs, books like Up the Down Staircase or White Teacher and some others, Ron Clark's Essential 55, other things that have gone through the syllabus in the years, at the end of the semester, I asked the students to write their own school story. What is their own experience of teaching and learning and schooling that they think has resonance both for them and for people going into the field? And I was wowed by the stories. I was overwhelmed by the experiences that our students had in Jewish day schools. And I collected them and I analyzed them. And 1/3 of the stories were about a special teacher, someone who had made an impact in their life. Another 1/3 of the stories were about a transformative experience, something that they engaged in that really had deep meaning for them. And then the 1/3 were wounding stories. They were stories of how in Jewish day schools, a teacher had shamed them, embarrassed them, called them out for cheating. And those stories, those wounding stories, really made me think about what was happening in Jewish schools, what was behind these choices, because nobody sets out to hurt somebody else who goes into Jewish education. And so I started to think about the preparation, professional preparation. And so both those studies had a huge impact swirling around in my head of what I was thinking about with education. And then the 3rd, I know this is the long answer. I told you this was the long answer. The 3rd was, we all have our own experiences from our own lives, from our own parents, from the people that matter to us in our lives. So when I was a little girl, my grandfather, my Zadie, who never finished high school because he had to go into work to support the family, taught me how to drive a nail, not hammer a nail, drive a nail. And he knew how to repair or fix anything, and he never finished high school. Story number 2, when I was a little girl, I was picking peaches with my father in the backyard. We had a peach tree in the backyard. And he explained to me when I was very little, I said, this is amazing. We have peaches. We're going to make peach pie. What are we going to do? Where did this come from? And he showed me the pit inside. He said, it all comes from this. He said, and I said, that's a miracle, right? That's a miracle. And then the 3rd story, and we all have our own lived experiences, was from my mom. When I was a little girl, we went to the Jewish Community Center for a Passover workshop program. And one of the stations, they had treif soup mix that they were using at that station to make matzo ball soup. My mom was livid. She went up to the director of the program and she said, "How could you do this? This is supposed to be a kosher program. I brought my daughter here to learn about Pesach. I'm supporting the community." And she grabbed me by the hand and we left. So those two research stories, plus my own lived experiences, and we know that education is not just in school. Really, we're swirling around in my mind, and that's in the long version how this book came to be.
Okay. I think the examples that you're showing also emphasize the theme of the book, where it's to parents and also teachers, and then the second half where it's teachers and also parents, and the obvious symbiotic relationship that should exist in an ideal world between the two partners for helping to educate a child. What would you want to emphasize about the role between parents and teachers? I want to share with everybody one quote that struck me. It might be a little bit out of context. It's part of, like, another thing I'd like to ask you about your use of metaphors. They're very artistic with what you're describing. So in this chapter, you were describing the balance between a home cook and a master chef to help explain the difference between what parents bring to the table and what educators bring to the table. And this is the line, and you can pick up your discussion from there: to divorce the profession from common sense understandings that parents, clergy, and many others teach seems unnecessarily awkward. Thinking about the spectrum from home cook to master chef may help revitalize the professionalism of teaching by situating the master teacher in context. So I guess really I'm asking two different things: the relationship between parents and teachers, and then why, since parents are obviously teaching their children also, why do teachers need to do something more? Why isn't it natural, as we might say, raising our children is? Why do we need professional training? Why do both of us need our jobs?
Okay, so those are a lot of questions. Let me start with the professionalism piece. And I spend a lot of time cooking, so a lot of my metaphors, I think, come from that environment. But, I know how to make a cheese souffle, but I'm no Ina Garten. And so the distinction, or Marcella Hazan, or whoever your favorite chef is, but there is that sense that I'm engaging in this task, I'm engaging in this craft. I also am working with materials, I'm working with food, I'm playing with the process, I'm producing something, but I know that I don't know. I know that there's a lot that I don't know. And I felt like that metaphor resonated with the sense of, yes, of course, parents educate, and of course, parents have to supplement the curriculum, and of course, parents should continue to stress what matters in their family and their values, and we know how important that is. But, and this is the Horace Mann piece, that teaching is an art and a science, that teaching is a profession, education is a profession, which has at its core professional knowledge, professional skills, professional dispositions designed for the context of a classroom. And we know when we speak about science, what we're speaking about is there is a precise way to launch a lesson. There is a precise amount of time that we think wait time should be. There are techniques and strategies and interventions and ways of differentiation. There is theory, there is content knowledge. There are attitudes that we know are more professional. So there is a whole discipline to education. And if we just say anybody can teach, then what we're actually doing is devaluing our profession. And many schools will hire somebody who just is an expert in their subject area, but that's not enough to make the learning concrete and alive and animated and engaged and secure with the learners. So when we talk, I think about education being a profession, and why I really stress not, unnecessary jargon, but key concepts, key vocabulary. We had this whole thing in one of my classes today about feedback, right? That is a specific word. It has a specific definition. We were doing non-linguistic representations, right? So I had asked the class to come up with non-linguistic representations for a core concept in the course. And students said feedback. Okay, they said feed back. And I said, that's actually not going to develop understanding, right? We have to own the definition for our terms. We have to be careful in our language use and intentional. And I think that if we don't do that, it's almost like we don't have enough self-respect for our own feet. And however will the parents, the community, others respect us if we don't respect ourselves?
What would you tell parents who are asking, why are you doing this way? Like, this isn't how I was educated, or like, I know how to educate my children. Why are you telling me? What would you ideally like the answer to be for parents about how you see the symbiotic relationship working? And I think this would be helpful for so many of the listeners who are dealing with parents in their professional lives now and have become parents, like they're seeing both sides of the equation, but to give them a framework and a language.
So we always want to validate, right? We always want to validate somebody's experience. Somebody's experience was true for them. And everybody has their own knowledge of their lived experience within them. And we have to honor that and validate that and respect that. And then we can say, here's another way to look at it. So it's really a matter of, you know, kind of meeting the parent where they're at, acknowledging respectfully their experience and their insights, and then introducing another perspective, another way of looking at it that really can communicate to them your professionalism, because you're going to speak from a place of knowing, from a place of using the correct terms for what you're talking about, for explaining to them what you know about their child and what you're seeing, because you know there's that old adage, like in describing the elephant, that somebody says that it's hard and somebody says that it's wrinkly and somebody says that it's hairy, and it's all different parts of the same thing, but people are only seeing one part. So and this is right, this is a famous quote from Jackson, who's done a lot of research in schools, that children don't act, students don't act the way they normally do when we're not around, that our presence in the room changes behavior. So a child with their parents is going to act one way, a child with their friends is going to act another way, a child with a teacher they don't like is going to act another way, and a child with a teacher where they feel comfortable is going to act differently. So I think we have to open up kind of this sense of, well, here's another way to look at it.
You mentioned professional dispositions. If you could elaborate what you mean by professional dispositions, how you think they can be taught. There's another quote I wanted to share with everybody that's like the next step of it, like what teachers should remember, or people being trained to be teachers. It is vital for teacher candidates to remember what it is like to be confused, to fail, to grapple with learning skills, so they can help their own students with similar struggles. Educators should be disposed to try new strategies and technologies throughout their career. So in that one quote that I took, and that there were different parts of the same paragraph. So what teachers need to bring to the table, what they need to remember, and part of the dispositions that you think help them become better teachers and professionals. Again, a very long question.
So teaching is hard, parenting is hard. We make a lot of mistakes. I'm not here to say that I am an effective in either realm. My children will back me up, I'm sure. But I think the disposition can be seen in the idea, and I'm going to cite, I was one of my first jobs in education, I was an assistant teacher at Ramaz. And the amazing teacher that I worked with had a quote over the board. The whole year long, same quote. It said, learning is a lifelong process. Learning is a lifelong process. At the end of the year, I took it down. She said, cut out those letters again, put it back up, cover it with newspaper, and it'll be ready for the first day of school for the next year. And that, you know, that ethos of where we have to be learning always. We do a lot of reflection in teacher education. How did it go? What could we do differently? What could we do better? What worked well? What wasn't effective? So that's got to be a disposition that you get comfortable making mistakes, you get comfortable taking risks, trying new things, not just repeating the same thing year after year, because this is a new group of students. And even though it worked with that group of students last year, it may not work now. They're different, their experiences are different. And then the second piece that you mentioned is this idea of grappling. This idea that we in education should understand that it's important to fail. It's important to try and not be successful and be okay with it, because that's what we're asking of our students. And we should never forget that the reason why we teach is to help those students that need teachers. Those students that get it on the first time and could probably teach themselves without you, that's not what we're doing there exclusively, right? That we need to be there for the students that need us. Now, there is this narcissistic thing in education that when students get it right away, we feel really puffed up, we feel really good about ourselves, we're an amazing teacher. That actually isn't the metric, right? That actually isn't the place that is going to, where we'd look at to show that it was our work, our effort with this child, differentiating, trying things a different way, that made the learning more possible for that learner.
Okay, I'm smiling. I'm hearing echoes of things that have come through the classrooms as well. You mentioned that there were 3 different types of stories that you analyzed when you were reviewing the stories your students had written, and one of them being the wounded stories. And I think what's very painful to hear, the stories where they felt they were shamed or belittled, especially by their Jewish studies teachers. So that's going to pivot me to the question of the role model piece. How should it come into education? What should a teacher be modeling? And what happens when they have their all too, like they're human and they lose their temper or lose their patience with students?
So there's a very there's a bunch of famous quotes that come from Miles Davis, who is a famous jazz musician. And he says, it's not the note you play that's the wrong note, it's the note you play afterwards that makes it right or wrong. So you should never think that something is irreversible, that teachers have to know how to apologize. My children have this really cool, I think, direction that they have taught me. I see them doing it to each other when they see that I'm getting upset, and they tell one another, okay, dial it back, rein it in. And I think that that phrase is so interesting, but what it means is that we have that self-control. We have that impulse management. We have that ability to dial it back, to rein it in. And that's something that is hard to learn. It's hard to teach children. And for ourselves, you know, there are moments we're not really proud of ourselves. And we have to go in the next day.
Okay. I'm thinking, I was watching with a class the other day, the Rita Pearson TED Talk that I know a lot of our students have said, I have watched, that every child deserves a champion. But I think one of my favorite vignettes that she talks about is when she's trying to teach her students fractions. And I was not very good at fractions, she says, and she taught the whole lesson wrong, went back to the teacher's book, realized, came back in the next day and apologized. So after their mouths dropped down, like my teacher's apologizing to me, they took it in stride. You were so happy with what you were doing. We just let it go. But that idea of the relationship, teachers are human, we can make mistakes, and it's what you do afterwards to repair is something very good.
Can I just add one thing that I think needs to be just emphasized here? The title that I used from this book, right, borrows from very famous and effective and important work by Doug Lemov, the Teach Like a Champion series, which was really the Bible for that's what they said, Lahavdil, the charter school where I did research. And a lot of the strategies in that book are amazing, right? Culture of error, everybody writes. A lot of the strategies are in cold call, and how to set that up effectively, are really important strategies to increase academic engagement and outcome. However, I felt that when I saw new teachers only exclusively work with that they had science and not art, that they didn't have the foundation yet, knew enough about classroom management, know enough about setting up a classroom community for those strategies that are isolated to make sense in the context of the classroom. But those books are amazing and really powerful, important resources for more, for teachers that have been in the field a little longer. So I really feel like that's an important piece to say, because I worked off of his title.
Okay. Why do you think Jewish education as a whole tends to devalue the field of education, both in the salaries they're paying their teachers and how they treat teachers and don't recognize the professional development and the professionalism and the training that they've put into becoming a teacher?
So I think we've come a long way, and I think that we have a way to go.
Okay.
I think the work, Deena, that you do with the Jewish day schools and the mentor programs that you have established are really very important structures to support new teachers. I think a little bit that it's like the air all around us, that our Masorah is so embedded in teaching and learning and sharing Torah. I once gave a talk about the Pesach Seder and how much pedagogy is actually like embedded in the whole process, inquiry and non-linguistic representations and experiential education. It's all there, right? So I feel a little bit like we think we know it, we breathe it, we don't see it. We just sort of all feel like we can do this because it's around us all the time. I talk a lot about, Philip Jackson. He says that the average child, by the time they finish high school, they've had 13,000 hours of interaction with classroom teachers. And he says, what child can't play teacher? Right? What child? It's funny, when I was a little kid and I played teacher, so I used to like to make worksheets and I lined up my stuffed animals. When my children played school and they were the teacher, they had a cup of coffee and they had a lanyard that, like how times have changed. But his idea was, that I think we've spent so much time in schools, and even in, every celebration, someone's prepping a Dvar Torah, right? So we're teaching in the ways that we know and are familiar to us. So I think that's a little bit of why we're all doing that. So I think that's a little bit why. However, there is this, we're all Hamish here in a Jewish school that brings warmth and community and familiarity and friendship and camaraderie. But we have to remember that the key piece is that there's a job with a contract and you're hired to teach these students this content this year. And so one of the things, and this is probably, this is a little hard to swallow. Sometimes students push back at me on this one. And it's that if you're hired to teach, your courses, Yehoshua, you're hired to teach the Sefer, and you decide that you want to work on the relationship with your students. So you're actually gonna, have a lot of discussions about other things because you know that you're going to make a relationship with your students instead of teaching the content. So I just want to put this out there to consider, right? That we know that the Torah is the blueprint for the world. We know that the Torah, learning Torah, is the way we connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so in a sense, what you're saying by depriving your students of more Torah is that the relationship with you, God forbid, is more important than the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a little intense, and I know that, but I'm just offering that as something to consider. Yes, there is time for these Friday sessions, right, where you take a question and you discuss it together. But if your contract says that you're supposed to be teaching them this text, right? So Torah is your anchor for your life. It's your blueprint. They should have those psukim, those understandings in their pockets their whole lives. If you're depriving them of that, I'm going to question that. You're not going to be in their pocket their whole life, but we want the Torah to be in their pocket the whole life, maybe in their heart also, their whole being.
I would also suggest that perhaps the implicit message you're giving them is that Sefer Yehoshua isn't as important. Like, I'm here to teach it to you, but I'm willing to send it out the window to build a relationship. What does that mean about the value of the subject I'm supposed to be teaching you? And what does that then do? What implicit message are you sending your student about the value of the text that you're here to engage them with?
Can I add one other thing, just because I know there's a lot of people on this chat that are in education. And I want, as I remind all my students, I remind my kids how important a contract is, right? That somebody can offer you a job verbally and then take it back. Right? Oh, that wasn't my understanding of what we were talking about, or I thought I had mentioned that. So really, really, really push schools to be professional also. Yes,
you're in writing.
Exactly. And I know people do like a letter of intent now rather than necessarily a contract, but documentation for yourself also.
Yes, I've been telling people, even if you have a conversation with somebody who's hiring you, write it up. These are my notes from our meeting, and send it to them so you both have a record of things. Because I've heard too many stories also of, oh, that wasn't the salary, or these were the conditions, or you misheard, and getting everything in writing. When we talk about role models, and hopefully that the administrators are role modeling what it should be to be a professional, we still have a ways to go. You start your book talking about that COVID-19 changed everything, and that this wasn't what you thought you would write about, or how it would, like the routines and schedules went out the window. How do you feel that the field of education has changed because of COVID now? Do you anticipate any changes in the future? And I would say both for parents and for teachers, because somebody was commenting the other day, it used to be teachers were very much siloized. What was going on in their classroom was going on in their classroom. They might have visitors, a principal might come in, but otherwise it was you and your students all day long. Suddenly, while you were teaching, your students' parents were in the background and maybe chiming in or asking questions as well. They were very much witnessing what was going on. So changes for the parents as the parents of children in education, and for the teachers teaching.
So I think one of the points that was made, in the world at large is that parents were not so comfortable being responsible for the education the whole day, that the parents trying to push their kids to sit in front of the computer and engage. was really difficult, and finding things for them to do in the home really very, very challenging. I think that COVID wounded a lot of people, that I think it stressed out people. I think we're still dealing with a lot of that trauma, parents and children. I think, though, that it also emphasizes what we talk about in education, this living with ambiguity, which is something that Dewey speaks about a lot. That the only preparation for the future is really paying attention to the present. That's a very important Dewey idea, that because we don't actually know what's going to be important in the next decade. I don't know, Deena, when I think about what I learned in high school, we had this requirement, we had to take a programming course, right? That they thought that everybody was going to need to know how to program. So I had to take a course, Intro to Pascal, which is a language like nobody even has heard of. So a lot of the things that we teach in schools, we think we know what somebody's going to need. The truth is, we don't really know. We don't really know. And the point of Dewey and this living with ambiguity idea is that you have to embrace uncertainty. And the way you embrace uncertainty is through inquiry, through wonder. I wonder, what if I did things like this? What if something might be different? And that what if question is really part of what we want to get students to wonder about. They say that that uncertainty can be addressed or met by curiosity, that curiosity can actually take down the anxiety that surrounds uncertainty. I wonder what it's going to be like. I don't know. I wonder if this is, and that is a way of kind of investing your imagination in the future without the anxiety about it. Because the truth is, teaching is all sort of a state of uncertainty. You know, I plan my lesson on paper. It's supposed to go like this. And then I walk into my classroom and the projector today is like hanging off the wall. So I think I'm using the slides, but I'm not sure they're going to project on this thing. And if I yank it, it might actually just fall on the floor. And then what am I going to do? So anybody in teaching knows that, and we used to do this in our program. I don't know if we do it anymore, but on the lesson plan, there was a what if section, like, what if, you know, this goes wrong, the tech doesn't work. One of my former students had a meeting with me over the summer, and she said to me, and she's working for a company now, she's not actually in the classroom anymore. She's working for a STEM company trying to sell software to schools. And she said to me, Dr. Hirsch, that was one of the most important things I ever learned from you, to always consider what's going to happen if the tech doesn't work, because many times it doesn't. But that's sort of the piece where you have to get your head around. There's a lot of discussion now in teacher education about the importance of improvisation. And how do we set our future teachers up to think flexibly on their feet? Because I can, and Lemov will tell you, script the answers or anticipate the answers. And one of the most amazing things about teaching is that there are surprises. You never know what somebody's going to ask, how somebody's going to respond. And that's what makes it so amazing and Baruch Hashem, so wonderful and meaningful.
Okay. I want to leave some time for questions from people. I have one coming in. If you could start thinking about your final thoughts. Here's the question I'm getting. How can a teacher inspire wonder in high school students who've been trained in a rigid way of not asking questions? They're so test focused. So it's very easy to imagine creating a system of wonder in an elementary or lower elementary, early childhood. How can we do that with our high school students?
So one vehicle for enhancing inquiry is really using the arts. That there's a process called VTS, visual thinking skills, where you can put up, let's say, an image. You can also do it with music, but it's easier to do it with an image. And you get them to say what they notice. You get them to say what they're wondering about. What do you see? What do you see that makes you say that? getting in every field, you can get students to wonder, but the works of art really lend themselves to the imagination, and imagination is really very tightly aligned to inquiry. So I would say that's a natural entry place. And then when students get comfortable asking questions, and we also want to kind of decouple questions from answers, that questions have a value on their own, even if we can't answer them. That's another important piece. You know, we're in the Google era where I'm teaching, I say something and somebody's quickly trying to find the answer. But I think we have to get used to living with questions. We have to get used to holding a question in our heads and our hearts for a long time. When we're working on something with a student in our classroom, whether it's instructional or it's a management thing, and we've tried a bunch of things and it's not working, we still have to be curious. We still have to, what else could I try? Who else could I talk to? What else, other resources are out there? So we really do want to raise the next generation to be critical thinkers, to wonder, to ask questions that we don't yet have an answer for, and to ask even better questions, to encourage them to work together to actually refine their inquiries. So I always find that works of art actually are natural vantage points or vistas, I guess, to start with.
Okay, I put out something on the chat for people to send in questions. Let me read another one that I got. How do we keep I guess teachers are teaching from feeling too artificial? While it is the teacher's job to impart skills, isn't it important to be real with them and not be focused only on the information? What is the balance? Kids don't learn from people they don't like. And
that's Rita Pearson. Yeah. So Deena, could you just give me the summary of what would you say that question is about?
That while we have to do skills, you don't want to only be about doing the skills, because you do want to build the relationship. So how do you balance out the skills and the information with developing the relationship with them as well?
So there's a word, this what's appropriate. And you're going to construct a professional identity. And the same way we've said that students are different with their parents and their friends, you have to have a professional persona in the classroom. And that is not your persona in your kitchen. Right? That's not your persona, at the Shabbos table, that there is a professional identity that teachers enact and co-construct in the classroom. And it has to be warm, right? It has to be inviting. We have to listen to students a lot. We have to be mindful when we're doing this too much.
Mm-hmm.
We have to try to make connections with things that matter to them, not just things that matter to us. We have to find out about their interests so that we can make connections to that in our teaching. A lot of times students will say to me, you're always pushing us to make real world firsthand connections to the content. And they say, it's hard. I said, yeah, it is hard. But when you can do that, there's something happening in the world that you can make that connection to in current events or in the Jewish community or wherever it is in the Torah, that when you can animate your subject matter in that way, you're making it alive for them and you're responding to things that matter to them. And that responsiveness brings the students in. Last week, I guess it was, for the first time, I wanted to talk more about universal design for learning. I wanted to talk more about setting up the environment in the classroom so that all children would have access to the learning. So if somebody's visually impaired or has some cognitive processing pieces, or they broke an arm, that how do we set up the environment for access? And one of the features is that we need to allow multiple forms of expression, that students should have choice in how they take that content and they represent it. And so the assignment that I gave my class was, something about a Q&A they had to do, some questions and some answers, do some research, and then they had a choice. gave them a choice about how to represent it. They could, of course, submit the Word doc with just the question and the answer. And a student in the class who hadn't been that vocal of a participant and never really seemed, not never, but had been somebody who, it's a morning class, so seemed always a little tired in the morning, came up to me with such a light in their eyes afterwards. And they said to me, could I write a poem? I said, really? You know, take the question, the answer, and put it in a poem? And she was like, yeah, I want to see if I can do it. And they didn't have to do it. The grade is going to be the same, but there's that thing when we pay attention to giving choice, to listening to students, to not just teaching the subject matter like this question was, but trying to see what's going to engage different learners, that I think is just so important.
It doesn't have to be regimented. The other question I got, which I think pivots back to beforehand with what we're telling them to do. I'll read the question. Is an inquiry a conflict with places that value conformity? So I think it can actually relate to both of the questions. So what would you say for that, where they're scared of the inquiry and the wonder, which I will say I always find ironic, because our Misor is all about asking questions. And when you're talking about the Pesach Seder, it's about asking questions. And it's not simply you stand up and recite the questions that Chazal have given us, but you're supposed to encourage the students to ask questions. And yet in some day schools, asking questions is verboten. So how would you deal with a school that doesn't value the questioning process? And I get, on the flip side, would be the charter school, the very Martinet-like, two different extremes, but really with the same educational philosophy, do what you're told.
So in order to answer this, I would say, and this comes from the scholarship on women in educational leadership, Reagan and Brooks, and we want to go from either or thinking to both and thinking. That there are multiple ways to teach, and schools need, and sometimes teachers might have to educate their administrators. That I can take the same content and I can set it up in a behaviorist way. I do, we do, you do. I can set it up in a constructivist way. I can tie it into prior knowledge, right? I can set it up in an experientialist way where I don't give a lot of concepts. I just set out some stations and have students have some experiences with things. So I think that we might need to educate some other people in the school gently, respectfully, politely. And that's what I would say. And it's that same sort of, I understand what you're saying, but here's another way to look at it.
In a few minutes, we do want to raffle up your book, and I'd like to give people a chance to say hello to you before our hour is over. So what would be your final thoughts or final message that you want to share? And what's that next project that you're working on?
Right. So we are right now, before Thanksgiving, we're before Hanukkah, and we know that some people eat turkey and some people don't eat turkey. Some people eat turkey on Shabbos because they got it free. Mm-hmm. We know that we're going to be spending a lot of time with family, and we know that it's hard sometimes with the people we love. We know that relationship skills really matter. We know that we have to teach people how to be an individual and a member of a community. In a classroom that's big, in a family that's big also. We're all banim lamakom. We're all, sort of children in one larger family. And we know from Tehillim, Hinei matovu manaim shavet achim gam yachad, that at the end of the day, we have to practice humility and compassion. We have to know that we don't know, and we want to err on the side of kindness.